The wind moved slowly across the English countryside, bending tall grass beneath a gray sky that seemed heavy with unspoken warnings. It was a kind of silence that came before something terrible, when even the birds sensed that the land itself was holding its breath. Men stood in fields that had once grown wheat, now trampled into mud by boots and hooves. They were farmers, blacksmiths, apprentices, soldiers only because power had demanded it of them. Thomas Gray pulled his cloak tighter around his shoulders. The metal of his helmet was cold against his skin, and his hands shook as he adjusted the leather strap beneath his chin. Around him, others pretended not to be afraid. Some laughed too loudly. Some stared into nothing. A few whispered prayers they had not spoken since childhood. "You ever been in a battle?" Thomas asked the man beside him. The man shook his head slowly. "Only in stories." From somewhere behind them came the sound of a drum, slow and deliberate, like a heartbeat growing louder. Banners lifted into the air, cloth snapping in the wind. Red roses on one side, white on the other. Most of the men could not say exactly why they fought beneath one color instead of the other. They only knew the name of their lord, and the punishment for disobedience. England was breaking, though few yet understood how deep the cracks ran. The king still lived, crowned and consecrated, but his rule was weak, his mind fragile. Decisions were made by men who spoke in whispers behind stone walls, men who smiled in daylight and sharpened knives at night. Power no longer rested on the throne. It drifted, dangerous and unclaimed, like a sword lying in the road. As dawn rose, the first arrows darkened the sky. The clash came suddenly. Steel met steel with a sound like screaming bells. The narrow streets filled with chaos, shouts, cries, the sickening thud of bodies hitting the ground. Thomas felt his feet slide on wet stone and realized, with a tightening in his chest, that the ground was already slick with blood. A man fell in front of him, eyes wide, mouth open as if still trying to speak. Thomas stepped over the body without meaning to, driven forward by the crush behind him. "Hold the line!" someone shouted. The words were lost almost immediately beneath the noise. Swords hacked, axes rose and fell, shields splintered. There was no room for elegance, no space for heroics. Men fought face to face, smelling each other's breath, hearing the ragged sound of dying lungs. Every strike was clumsy. Every victory felt like survival stolen from someone else. In the confusion, leaders fell, orders dissolved. The battle turned on moments no one could later fully remember. A gate forced open, a sudden charge through an alley. A commander struck down before his men realized he was gone. When it ended, it did not feel like triumph. It felt like exhaustion. The king was found wounded, sheltered behind hastily raised defenses, his eyes distant as if he were watching the war from far away. He lived, but something sacred had been damaged. Blood had been spilled too close to the crown, and everyone present understood, even if they could not say aloud, that nothing would be the same again. As the survivors withdrew, the streets were left strewn with broken weapons, torn banners, and bodies waiting to be claimed. The smell of iron hung in the air. Thomas sat against the wall, breathing hard, staring at his hands. They were red to the wrist. That night, fires burned in camps across England. Men spoke in low voices about what they had seen. Some boasted, trying to convince themselves they were brave. Others said nothing at all. Messengers rode through darkness, carrying news that would harden hearts and sharpen ambitions. Far from the battlefield, a woman listened to those reports with a stillness that frightened even her allies. She understood what the others did not yet dare admit. This was no brief rebellion. This was the beginning of a war that would not end until families were destroyed, names erased, and England itself was forced to choose what kind of kingdom it would become. The roses had been stained with blood, and blood, once spilled, has a memory. Smoke drifted across the camps as morning broke, thin and bitter, clinging to clothes and hair. The survivors of the first clash moved like ghosts among the tents, stepping around the wounded, avoiding the eyes of the dead. Victory had been claimed, yet no one felt victorious. War had a way of hollowing men out before they realized it had begun. Thomas Gray woke with his sword still in his hand. For a moment he did not know where he was. Then the smells returned, damp earth, sweat, old blood, and memory rushed back like a blow to the chest. Around him men stirred, some groaning softly. others staring up at the sky as if asking for answers. "They say it's over," someone muttered nearby. Thomas said nothing. He had already learned that nothing was ever truly over. Horses were being saddled again before noon. Messengers arrived, breathless, carrying orders that contradicted the ones given the night before. Lords argued in clusters, voices sharp, faces tight with suspicion. Alliances formed and broke in the span of a single conversation. Every man watched his neighbor a little more closely now, wondering where loyalty truly lay. The armies did not disband. They grew. Villages were emptied of able-bodied men. Fields were left untended. Church bells rang not for prayer, but for summons. Blacksmiths worked until their hands bled, turning plowshares into spearheads. England was being reshaped into a weapon. As weeks passed, the fighting spread like fire. Open fields became killing grounds. Rivers carried bodies downstream. Each battle taught commanders what the last had revealed: how to break a shield wall, how to draw an enemy into pursuit, how fear could be turned into a blade sharper than steel. The soldiers learned too. Thomas learned the sound a man makes when he is struck in the belly. He learned how to step over corpses without looking down. He learned that the bravest men were often the quietest, and that screams usually came from those already beyond saving. Before one engagement, as rain hammered down and turned the ground to mud, a young soldier beside him began to shake uncontrollably. "I can't," the boy whispered. "I can't do this again." Thomas wanted to lie, wanted to tell him it would be quick, or that God watched over them. Instead, he placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Just stay close," he said. "That's all any of us can do." When the horn sounded, the world narrowed to a few yards of chaos. Horses charged and slipped, crushing men beneath their hooves. Arrows fell like rain, hissing through the air before finding flesh. Commanders shouted until their voices broke. The ground swallowed boots and refused to let go. At the height of the fighting, a banner fell. For a heartbeat, everything froze. Then panic rippled through the ranks. Men began to fall back, then to run. What had been an army became a flood of bodies surging away from death. The pursuit was merciless. Those who fled were cut down from behind. Mercy was a word for priests and poets, not for men who had lost brothers and sons. By the time the sun dipped low, the field was silent except for the cries of the wounded and the crows already gathering. Afterward, the commander spoke of strategy and necessity. They marked maps with ink and blood alike, explaining why this loss was acceptable, why that sacrifice had been required. The soldiers listened, but the words passed through them like smoke. They knew only what they had seen. The war changed them. News traveled faster than the armies themselves. Each victory fed new resentment. Each defeat demanded revenge. Noble houses raised private forces, wearing their colors like armor against fear. The idea of peace began to sound naive, even dangerous. One evening, as Thomas cleaned his blade by firelight, he overheard two men arguing nearby. "This isn't about the king anymore," one said. "It never was," the other replied. Those words stayed with him. When the next great battle came, it was larger than anything before it. Thousands moved as one dark mass across open ground, banners snapping, drums beating a rhythm that seemed to shake the earth itself. The clash was thunderous. Lines broke and reformed. Charges were met and repelled. Men fought until their arms went numb, until instinct replaced thought. At the center of it all, commanders made choices that decided the fate of hundreds in seconds. A flanking maneuver here, a delayed retreat there. When one side finally collapsed, it did so completely, leaving the field and the future to its enemy. That night, there were no cheers. Fires burned low. Survivors sat in silence, staring into flames as if hoping to see something other than what they remembered. Some wept openly. Others could no longer cry. Thomas lay awake, listening to the wind move through the camp. He thought of home, of fields that would not be planted this year, of names that would never again be spoken. He understood now that even if one side claimed final victory, the cost would be beyond counting. The war was no longer a question of who should rule. It was a test of how much England could endure before it broke. Winter came early, or so it felt to the men who marched through freezing rain and endless mud. Armor rusted. Cloaks grew heavy with water. Every step sank into the earth as if the land itself were trying to pull him under. Hunger gnawed constantly now, sharper than fear. Bread was hard. Meat was rare. What warmth the campfires offered was stolen back by the wind as soon as men stepped away. Thomas Gray's boots had split along the seams. He wrapped rags around his feet before each march, praying they would last one more day. Around him, faces had grown thinner, eyes darker. The war was carving itself into them, leaving marks no victory could erase. Orders arrived with a new urgency. Another army was moving. Another confrontation was inevitable. There was no longer any talk of avoiding battle, only of meeting it on better ground. The morning of the clash broke under a low, iron-colored sky. Frost clung to the grass, crunching beneath boots as the lines formed. Across the field, the enemy stood just as weary, just as afraid. For a moment, the distance between them felt like the last fragile thread holding the world together. A horn sounded. The advance was slow at first. Shields raised, weapons ready. Then the arrows came. Men fell without a sound, their bodies folding as if the strings had been cut. Others screamed, clutching at shafts embedded in flesh. The lines collided with a force that knocked the breath from Thomas's lungs. Time lost its meaning. There was only motion and resistance. Push, strike, stumble, recover. Mud sucked at his feet. A blow glanced off his helmet, ringing his ears until the world blurred. Somewhere close, a man prayed aloud between gasps for air. The turning point came when the cavalry charged. They burst from the flank like a storm, horses screaming, iron-shod hooves tearing through flesh and bone. Infantry ranks shattered. Panic spread faster than any command could contain it. Men dropped weapons to run. Others stood frozen, too shocked to move. Thomas was knocked to the ground. For a terrifying second, he lay staring up at the gray sky as hooves thundered past inches from his head. A fallen body shielded him, warm and heavy. He pushed it away and scrambled to his feet, heart hammering. By the time the dust settled, the field belonged to one side. The defeated fled into the trees, hunted down until darkness finally brought an end to the killing. Snow began to fall, soft and indifferent, settling over bodies that would never rise again. After the battle, the commanders gathered beneath a torn banner. Their voices were low, measured. This victory meant leverage. It meant momentum. It meant the war could now be driven forward instead of merely endured. For the soldiers, it meant marching again. Villages along the route were stripped bare. Grain, livestock, anything of value was taken in the name of necessity. Doors were broken down. Protests were silenced. War fed itself without remorse. Thomas watched a woman clutch her child as soldiers led away the family's last cow. He looked away, shame burning hotter than the cold. That night, the camp was restless. Rumors spread like infection, of betrayals, of secret alliances, of noblemen already negotiating the next phase of power. Men whispered names with hatred and hope tangled together. One rumor in particular refused to die, a claim that the crown itself might soon change hands. The idea terrified and thrilled in equal measure. For years, the king had been a distant symbol, weak but sacred. To imagine him replaced by force was to imagine a world without limits. As days passed, news confirmed what whispers had suggested. A decisive confrontation loomed. One that would not simply decide a battle, but the future direction of the entire war. Forces were gathering on a scale unseen before. Thomas felt it in his bones. This was different. This was not just another fight to survive. On the eve of the march, he sat with a small group around a dying fire. No one spoke for a long time. Finally, the boy who had once shaken with fear broke the silence. "If we live," he said quietly, "will any of this matter?" The question hung in the air. Thomas searched for an answer and found none that felt true. All he could offer was this: "We'll remember." As the fire went out, darkness closed in, thick and absolute. Somewhere in that darkness, thousands of men moved toward one another, carrying banners, weapons, and the weight of a kingdom's fate. The war was no longer grinding forward in uncertainty. It was racing toward something final, and no one could stop it. The march was relentless. Mud-caked boots and armor. Freezing rain seeped through every layer of clothing, and the wind seemed to cut deeper than any blade. Each day blurred into the next, measured only by the rhythm of drums and the crack of distant arrows. England itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next blood-soaked chapter to unfold. Thomas Gray's hands were raw from gripping his sword for hours at a time. His eyes had grown accustomed to the sight of death. Men sprawled in mud, blood soaking into frozen earth, horses struggling under the weight of their riders in the chaos of battle. Yet each fallen friend still struck him with the force of a hammer. War had a cruel way of making heroes out of ordinary men and then teaching them how little they mattered. The soldiers moved in columns that stretched for miles, banners snapping in the wind like the screams of 1,000 voices. Each commander rode at the front, face set, eyes scanning for weaknesses, ears straining for the subtle cues that meant survival or doom. There were no illusions now about what lay ahead. Every village, every field could become a battlefield. Every road could be lined with hidden spears or arrows. Every shadow could hide death. As they approached the next stronghold, word arrived of a new development. A smaller army had broken from the main Lancastrian forces to harry supply lines, raiding villages and cutting off provisions. Commanders cursed and shouted orders, knowing that starvation could be as deadly as the sword. The soldiers, already exhausted, grumbled but obeyed. There was no choice. To stand still was to die. To fall behind was to be left for scavengers. The battle began before sunrise, as if the dark itself was conspiring with war. Arrows arced silently through the gray sky, before striking men and horses alike. The clash of swords rang sharp, metallic, and merciless. Thomas found himself in the thick of it, every movement instinctual, driven by survival rather than strategy. He parried, struck, dodged, and staggered forward, mud sucking his boots with every step. Around him, men screamed, cursed, and prayed in a language that was raw and desperate. A surge of cavalry hit the flanks. The shockwave of horses charging through foot soldiers sent men sprawling, shields shattering, bodies crushed under hooves. Thomas was thrown sideways, rolling in the mud, his sword skidding out of reach. He scrambled, lunging for it as a rider passed too close. The rider's lance grazed his shoulder, tearing through leather and cloth, leaving a shallow but burning wound. Pain roared in his arm, but there was no time to dwell. Survival demanded forward motion. Again and again, the battle swayed, moment to moment, like a tide. Victory seemed possible one second and utterly impossible the next. Leaders shouted, gesturing, trying to impose order on chaos, but the field belonged to chance. Arrows whistled past Thomas's head. Horses screamed. Steel struck steel. Men fell in pools of mud and blood, swallowed almost immediately by the press of soldiers behind them. At a critical moment, a signal went up, a white flag on the enemy's side. For a second, hope flickered. Then it was gone. The enemy had not surrendered, but instead feigned retreat, drawing a portion of the army into an ambush. Thomas, caught in the front line, barely managed to roll away from a spear thrust that would have ended him. Around him, men screamed, realizing too late the trap had closed. The fighting continued for hours, relentless and unforgiving. Thomas felt his strength ebb, each movement slower than the last. He watched friends fall, some he had known for only days, others for months, their faces etched into his memory, silent witnesses to the horror that unfolded on every field. Yet there was no time for mourning. Survival demanded cold efficiency. Every strike, every parry a prayer to live another minute. By late afternoon, the battle began to settle into grim exhaustion. Bodies lay across the fields, a carpet of mud, blood, and broken banners. Horses wandered aimlessly, some grazing, some whinnying in confusion. Survivors staggered, leaning on one another, dragging their wounded, wiping the blood from faces and hands in a futile attempt to reclaim their humanity. Commanders gathered briefly to assess the outcome. Though the ambush had taken its toll, their forces had held. Some relief coursed through the weary men, but it was fleeting. Every victory had a cost that could never be repaid. Villages lay empty, fields destroyed, supplies depleted. England itself was beginning to feel the weight of war, the economy strained, morale frayed, loyalty tested. That night, Thomas sat near a dying fire, cleaning his blade, staring at the flickering flames as if they could answer the questions in his mind. How many more would die? How many more fields would be soaked in blood? And for what? Roses had turned from symbols of loyalty to symbols of slaughter. The future of England, once a matter of kings and laws, was now a matter which family could endure the longest, wield power the strongest, and shed blood the most ruthlessly. Nearby, soldiers murmured prayers, some to God, some to whatever chance would keep them alive. Thomas did not pray. He only watched the smoke rise into the cold night sky, carried with it the echoes of screaming, the smell of mud and blood, and the sense that the war was only beginning in earnest. In the darkness, Margaret of Anjou plotted, Richard of York maneuvered, and the land itself waited, silent and indifferent. The next battle would come, as inevitable as the frost that coated their armor and the snow that would one day cover the fields. Thomas felt it in his bones. The war was far from over. Survival today was only a preparation for the slaughter of tomorrow. England was changing. The old order was breaking, and every man who fought knew that when the war ended, whether through victory or exhaustion, nothing would ever be the same again. The roses had bloomed in blood, and the petals carried the scent of war, lingering long after the fighting had ceased. Every step forward promised another clash, another test of courage, another reckoning for the cost of loyalty, ambition, and power. Thomas lay back on the cold ground, listening to the wind through the tents and the distant cries of the wounded. For the first time, he understood fully that there would be no end to the fear, the pain, or the relentless push toward the next battle. The Wars of the Roses had begun in earnest, and England was caught in their merciless grip. Survival was no longer just a matter of skill or luck. It was a matter of endurance, of heart, and of willingness to face horrors that no song could ever honor. The night was long, but it would pass. And when morning came, so would war again. Dawn broke gray and bitter. The sky a low, oppressive dome that seemed to press down on the soldiers as they prepared to march once more. Mud clung to boots and armor, every step a battle against the earth itself. Thomas Gray tightened the straps on his helm and tested the edge of his sword, the blade dull from hours of constant use but still a lifeline. Around him, men moved silently, faces pale, eyes hollow. They had learned the true cost of courage. It was measured in the bodies around them, in the screams that would echo forever in memory. Orders came from the commanders, shouted over the wind, barked like dogs at the pack. A new target had been identified, a Lancastrian stronghold that had defied earlier advances. The strategy was simple. Strike hard, strike fast, and leave nothing behind that could sustain the enemy. Simple, perhaps, in theory. But war had a habit of complicating every plan with chaos, fear, and chance. As the army advanced, scouts reported that the enemy had fortified the position, surrounding it with trenches and stakes, preparing for an ambush. The soldiers groaned, the weight of inevitability settling over them. Thomas knew that this would be unlike any battle before. There would be no room for mistakes, no opportunity to falter. Every choice, every step, every swing of the sword could mean the difference between life and death. The clash began in the pre-dawn stillness. Arrows hissed through the cold air, striking men and horses alike. Shields splintered. Screams echoed to the fog as the soldiers collided with the enemy, a tide of mud and steel and fear. Thomas fought without thought, muscles moving on memory and instinct, every breath a prayer to survive. Around him, men fell. Some screamed, some did not. The smell of blood and wet earth filled his senses so completely that it seemed to seep into his skin. A sudden explosion of movement came from the enemy flank. Cavalry charged, hooves thundering, lances aimed to break the line. Soldiers were thrown aside, crushed under weight and momentum. Thomas rolled, narrowly avoiding the hooves of a panicked horse, and scrambled back to his feet. The world had become a blur of mud, steel, and shouts, every second stretching endlessly, each heartbeat counting as a small victory. The battle turned when the commanders executed a maneuver learned from earlier clashes. Part of the army feigned retreat, drawing the enemy into a narrow field where the ground worked against them. Spears and archers lay hidden, waiting for the moment to strike. When the trap was sprung, the enemy was caught between two forces, arrows falling from above, blades cutting from the front, horses charging from the side. Panic spread like wildfire. Men screamed as their formation collapsed. Thomas pressed forward, cutting through men who had once been neighbors, now indistinguishable enemies. He caught sight of a young boy, no older than 15, wielding a sword too heavy for him, swinging wildly. Thomas grabbed him by the shoulder. "Stay close. Don't fight alone." The boy nodded, eyes wide with terror, and followed him through the chaos. Hours passed, though it was impossible to know how many. The sun rose and fell hidden behind thick clouds. Bodies piled in muddy trenches. Horses wandered aimlessly, some grazing, some dead. Commanders moved like shadows among the living, issuing orders, assessing losses, planning the next move. Each decision was ruthless, each choice measured in human cost. Finally, the field fell silent. The enemy had been routed, their lines broken, their banners captured. But the victory was hollow. Hundreds lay dead. Thousands were wounded. The land itself seemed to mourn, soaked in blood and scarred by hoof and boot. Thomas sat on a fallen log, chest heaving, sword in hand, staring at the devastation. There was no celebration here, only exhaustion, grief, and the quiet understanding that this was far from over. As night fell, fires burned in the distance, signaling the remnants of the enemy fleeing into the forests. The soldiers, covered in mud and blood, tended to their wounded, shared what little food they had, and tried to find warmth. Conversations were few. Most men stared into the fire, lost in thought, haunted by memories too heavy to voice. Thomas thought of home, of his family, of fields that would never again see harvest. War had claimed not just men, but the very future of the land. In a quiet moment, a messenger arrived with news from the north. Another army was gathering, stronger and better supplied. The war, it seemed, would not end with single victory or a single battle. Each engagement was merely the prelude to the next, each triumph paving the way for another confrontation. Thomas listened in silence, feeling the weight of inevitability settle over him like a shroud. That night, as the soldiers slept fitfully in tents and under tarps, Thomas remained awake, staring at the stars obscured by clouds. He thought of the men he had lost, the friends who would never return, the countless others who would follow. He understood now that courage was not a moment of heroism, but a daily endurance, a refusal to collapse in the face of relentless horror. And sacrifice. It was not a story told in songs or poems, but reality written in mud, blood, and sorrow. Margaret of Anjou and Richard of York plotted their next moves, unaware of individual suffering, their focus entirely on power and strategy. England was their chessboard, and every man, woman, and village of peace moved according to ambition. For Thomas and the soldiers, these plans were abstract, distant, yet their consequences fell with crushing immediacy on every step, every strike, every life. As dawn approached again, Thomas prepared for another march. His body ached. His mind raced with memories of the last battle. Yet he forced himself to rise. There was no choice. The war demanded relentless movement, constant vigilance, and unyielding resolve. He tightened his cloak, adjusted his sword, and stepped into the cold morning air, knowing that survival was temporary and that the next battle was already waiting. The roses had been soaked in blood. England itself had begun to change. And Thomas Gray, like so many others, understood that the cost of loyalty, courage, and survival was higher than any of them could imagine. The Wars of the Roses were far from over, and the path ahead promised only more death, more destruction, and the slow, grinding transformation of a kingdom under fire. The frost lingered long after the sun rose, clinging to the edges of armor and the tips of swords. Each breath came in white clouds, carrying the bitter taste of smoke and iron. The army moved slowly, every step a negotiation with mud and exhaustion. Thomas Gray's legs burned, his back ached, yet he kept pace, driven by the unspoken understanding that falling behind meant death, or worse, being left to witness friends perish alone. The war had changed the men. Faces were hollow, eyes hard, voices quiet. Even laughter, when it came, carried a sharp edge, a reminder of how easily joy could be ripped away. Soldiers whispered of battles past, of the friends who would never return, and of the villages that had been burned to ensure no enemy provisions remained. Every memory, every image, was etched into their minds like scars they could never hide. Orders came from the commanders, crisp and deliberate. The next objective was a fortified town along a narrow river valley, a strategic point that could turn the tide in the region. Intelligence suggested the enemy was prepared, reinforced by mercenaries and local militias. No one expected a simple march or an easy battle. Preparation was meticulous. Scouts mapped the terrain, engineers surveyed the defenses, and soldiers sharpened their weapons, checked armor, and prayed, though some no longer knew who or what they were praying to. The march toward the town was tense. Thomas noticed a nervous energy among the men, the way fingers twitched over hilts, the way eyes scanned the tree lines for signs of ambush. Every rustle of leaves, every sudden movement drew attention. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath, silent witnesses to the inevitability of bloodshed. As the army neared the town, the enemy revealed their position. Archers lined the walls, their arrows tipped with fire, while small artillery pieces rattled against stone, sending smoke curling into the sky. From behind fortifications, infantry waited, ready to pour on to the attackers the instant they approached. Thomas felt a cold weight settle over him. Not fear, but recognition. This would be a fight unlike any before, a confrontation where every mistake could be fatal. The initial assault began at dawn. Arrows streaked across the sky, striking men and horses alike. Shields splintered. Screams rose above the wind, above the clash of steel. Thomas moved as he had learned, instinct over thought, dodging, striking, and pressing forward despite the chaos around him. Men fell beside him, some moaning, some silent, and he forced himself to look away, focusing only on the next movement, the next step, the next breath. The town's walls proved formidable. Attempts to scale them were met with boiling oil and hammers, spears and arrows raining down. Men fell from ladders, limbs broken, bodies impaled. Every advance was met with resistance. Every inch of ground gained purchased at tremendous cost. Thomas fought tirelessly, cutting through enemy lines, dragging the wounded to relative safety when possible. Each life saved was a small victory, yet the number of lost friends overshadowed it relentlessly. By midday, both sides had suffered heavy casualties, and the battle turned into brutal hand-to-hand combat in the narrow streets. Mud and blood mixed underfoot, the air thick with smoke and the smell of fear. Civilians had fled or hidden, leaving buildings abandoned but dangerous. Archers fired from windows, and the shattered walls made every corner a potential trap. Thomas moved cautiously, every strike precise, every step calculated. The tide shifted in their favor only when commanders executed a coordinated assault on the town's gates. Engineers had prepared explosive charges, and when they detonated, the gates splintered, allowing soldiers to pour inside. The enemy, caught off guard, attempted to regroup, but was overwhelmed by sheer numbers and relentless aggression. Victory, however, was Pyrrhic. The streets were littered with the dead and dying, the cries of the wounded echoing long after the battle's climax. Thomas walked among the survivors, checking on friends, helping carry the injured to makeshift triage areas. Each face he passed told a story of survival and loss, a reminder that the cost of even a victory was nearly unimaginable. The commanders moved through the town, shouting orders, assessing damage, and calculating the next strategic move. Every decision had consequences measured in blood and ruin. As night fell, the soldiers gathered around fires that burned low, the wind carrying the smell of smoke and mud through the streets. Exhaustion pressed down on every man. Thomas leaned against the wall, sword in hand, watching the stars peek through the clouds. Silence fell, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the distant cries of crows. Conversations were sparse. Some whispered prayers. Others spoke quietly of home, of families, of fields left untended, of futures now uncertain. Thomas listened without speaking, the weight of experience settling over him like a shroud. Courage, he realized, was no longer a moment of heroism, but a continuous act of facing horror and moving forward. Sacrifice was not a tale for songs or poems. It was written in mud, blood, and sorrow, and carried in the minds of every man who survived. Messages arrived in the night, warning of another army gathering to reclaim the town. The commanders conferred, planning, maneuvering, and plotting. England itself seemed to be a chessboard. Every village, every soldier, every road a piece to be moved according to ambition, strategy, and greed. For the men on the ground, these plans were abstract, yet their consequences fell immediately, brutally, and without mercy. Thomas lay awake, listening to the wind and distant cries. He thought of friends lost, of villages burned, of the countless others who would follow. He understood fully now that the war was far from over. Every victory was temporary. Every life saved was a fleeting triumph. The war demanded endurance, resilience, and the constant willingness to face horrors that would haunt them forever. As dawn approached, Thomas rose again. His body ached. His mind raced with memories of battles fought and lives lost. Yet there was no choice. The war pressed forward, relentless, demanding yet another march, another confrontation, another test of courage and survival. The roses had been soaked in blood. England itself had begun to change. And Thomas Gray, like countless others, understood that the path ahead promised only more death, more destruction, and the slow, grinding reshaping of a kingdom under fire. The Wars of the Roses had entered a new phase. Every step forward, every swing of a blade, every life lost was part of a chain that would bind the fate of England for years to come. Thomas tightened his cloak against the cold, grasped his sword, and prepared to move once more, knowing that survival was temporary, victory fragile, and the cost of war immeasurable. The cold lingered like a living thing, wrapping around men and horses alike as the army pressed forward through forests and fields. Mud clung to boots, armor weighed heavily, and every breath Thomas Gray took felt sharper than the last. They had learned the cost of war in the blood of friends, in the moans of the wounded, and in the endless march through the rain that seemed determined to swallow them whole. Yet there was no reprieve. The commanders pressed relentlessly onward, knowing that hesitation could be fatal, and that each delay allowed the enemy to regroup, strengthen, and strike back with vengeance. The next target was a fortified manor on a hill, its stone walls strong, its defenders prepared and resolute. Scouts returned with reports. Trenches had been dug, stakes planted, archers positioned with lethal precision. The commanders met in secret, whispering strategies and contingencies, weighing each choice as though the lives of hundreds rested on their deliberations. Because they did. Thomas listened from the edge of the camp. The discussion, a cold reminder that men like him were expendable pieces in a much larger game. When the army approached, the first volleys of arrows fell like a black storm from the battlements. Screams rose above the wind as men were struck down before they could raise their shields. Shields splintered. Horses reared in panic, hooves striking men beneath them. The smell of blood and wet earth thickened in the air. Thomas advanced, parrying and striking, moving almost without thought, guided only by instinct and the constant need to survive. Around him, men fell in waves, their faces etched with terror, pain, or grim determination. The assault slowed as defenders poured boiling oil and hurling stones from the walls. Many soldiers fell, burned or crushed under debris, while others scrambled for cover in the narrow approaches. Thomas felt the heat on his back, smelled the acrid smoke, and fought his way forward through the chaos. Each movement was calculated, each strike measured, but even skill could not protect a man from the randomness of death in such close quarters. At the center of the struggle, commanders attempted a coordinated breach. Engineers had prepared ladders and siege tools, and the plan was to overwhelm the defenders by sheer force of numbers. Thomas climbed one such ladder, though it slippery with rain and mud, feeling the weight of not just his body but the hopes of those behind him. At the top, he swung his sword blindly, cutting at any enemy who came near. Arrows flew past him, some striking men beside him, others thudding into the wood with horrifying accuracy. The defenders were relentless. Every gain was met with resistance. Every inch forward was paid for in blood. Thomas watched as a friend, no older than 20, fell beside him, pierced by a spear. He wanted to scream, to rage, to weep, but there was no time. Another wave pressed forward, forcing him to move, to fight, to survive. Pain and exhaustion blurred together, and for a moment, Thomas felt himself detached, a soldier in a machine that ground men into mud, without care for individuality or life. The tide turned when the siege engines breached the wall. A deafening crash of stone and timber created a gap wide enough for soldiers to pour through. Chaos erupted. Defenders attempted to regroup, but the sudden pressure of numbers overwhelmed them. Thomas moved with the flow of men, cutting down anyone who blocked the way, helping the wounded where he could. Victory, when it came, was immediate but fleeting. Fields within the walls were strewn with the dead, screams of pain still echoing, fires smoldering in every corner. By nightfall, the manor had fallen, but at an unimaginable cost. Hundreds were dead, more were wounded, many beyond recovery. The soldiers who survived trudged through the mud, silent and weary, their faces gone from exhaustion and shock. Thomas sat against a fallen wall, his sword resting across his knees, staring at the devastation. There was no triumph here, only the hollow satisfaction of having survived one more day. The commanders moved among the survivors, tallying losses, organizing defenses, and preparing for the inevitable counterattack. England was no longer a land of order. It was a battlefield, a canvas painted with blood, fire, and desperation. The soldiers understood that every victory brought with it another challenge, another wave of horror, and another test of endurance. In the quiet moments, Thomas reflected on what he had seen. He thought of friends lost in previous battles, of villages burned, of families torn apart. Courage had become a habit, a necessity, not a virtue. Sacrifice was constant, unrelenting, and never fully honored. Men were remembered only in whispers or in the bodies that lay in fields, the ground soaked with their final blood. Messages arrived through the night, warning of enemy forces gathering nearby, determined to reclaim the manor and punish the victors. The commander spoke in low tones, planning maneuvers, calculating risks, and issuing orders that would decide the fate of men who had no say in their own survival. England itself seemed to respond to the will of ambition and strategy, indifferent to human suffering. Thomas lay awake beside the fire, listening to the wind and distant cries, thinking of the future he might never see. Each night, the thought of home grew sharper, more painful, yet hope was fragile and fleeting. Every step, every battle, every breath was a reminder that survival was temporary and fragile. The roses had been bathed in blood. England itself was changing, and men like Thomas were both witnesses and victims of its transformation. As dawn approached, he rose once more. His body ached, his mind weighed down by the memories of another day of slaughter. Yet there was no choice. The war pressed onward, relentless, demanding another march, another battle, another test of courage and endurance. Survival was uncertain. Victory was temporary, and the cost of war was beyond calculation. The Wars of the Roses had become a storm from which there was no shelter. Every swing of the sword, every life lost, every village destroyed was part of a chain that bound the fate of England and its people. Thomas Gray adjusted his armor, gripped his sword, and stepped forward into the cold morning light, knowing that the next battle waited, as merciless and inevitable as the last. England was changing forever, and the men who fought, bled, and survived would carry its memory in every scar, every wound, and every shadow of fear that followed them, long after the roses had withered in the blood-stained soil. The air was sharp and biting as the army moved once more, the landscape frozen and desolate under a pale winter sun. Frost clung to armor, to boots, and to the edges of weapons, each step a struggle through mud and ice. Thomas Gray's legs ached with the endless march, muscles strained, joints stiff. Around him, men shuffled forward in silence, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes hollow from witnessing too many horrors. They had learned that survival was less about skill and more about endurance. The next objective was a fortified town along the river, strategically vital for controlling the surrounding countryside. Scouts returned with grim reports. The enemy had entrenched themselves, digging trenches, erecting barricades, and placing archers in every vantage point. The commanders gathered quietly, poring over maps, whispering strategies, debating contingencies. For them, every decision was calculated, every action measured in terms of advantage and loss. For the men on the ground, it meant marching into certain danger, yet obeying orders with grim determination. As they approached, the first volleys of arrows struck without warning. The sound was eerie, a whistling hiss that preceded pain. Men fell instantly. Horses reared and screamed, and a clash of steel rang sharp across the frozen fields. Thomas moved instinctively, parrying strikes, swinging his sword, and pressing forward despite exhaustion. Around him, chaos reigned. Friends fell. Screams pierced the air, and the mud beneath their feet became slick with blood and ice. The defenders of the town were relentless. Boiling oil poured from battlements. Stones and firepots struck soldiers as they attempted to scale walls. Every approach was met with resistance, so fierce it was almost impossible to advance. Thomas felt the heat of burning wood on his back, and the sting of arrows grazing armor. Panic rippled through the ranks, but discipline held the line. One step at a time, inch by inch, the soldiers pressed forward. A turning point came when siege engineers prepared explosive charges against the main gate. The thunderous crash as the gate splintered sent shockwaves through both armies. Soldiers surged through the breach, swords raised, shouting, trampling those who stood in their way. The defenders tried to regroup, but the sudden onslaught was too powerful. Thomas found himself in the center of the chaos, cutting through men with every ounce of strength left in his body. The air was thick with smoke, blood, and the acrid smell of burning wood. The battle turned into brutal hand-to-hand fighting in the narrow streets. Mud, blood, and snow mixed underfoot, each step treacherous. Archers fired from windows. Buildings became traps, and corpses littered every alley. Thomas moved cautiously, parrying blows and striking back. Sometimes at enemies he could not distinguish from friends in the heat of combat. Every sound, scream, clash, shout, was amplified by adrenaline, fear, and a constant awareness of mortality. By midday, both sides were exhausted, casualties mounting at an alarming rate. The field was littered with the dead and dying, groans and cries echoing in the cold air. Yet the commanders pressed on, shouting orders, reorganizing troops, planning the next move. Every decision had consequences measured in human lives. Victory came, but it was Pyrrhic. The town had fallen, yet hundreds were dead, more were wounded, and the land itself was scarred and burning. Thomas walked among the survivors, helping carry the injured, checking on friends, and silently counting the cost of another battle. Each face told a story of suffering and endurance, of courage that had been paid for in blood. Men who had laughed and joked weeks before were now hollow-eyed and silent. The weight of loss hung over them like a storm cloud, yet there was no respite. The war pressed on, unrelenting. As night fell, fires burned low in the town, the wind carrying the smell of smoke, blood, and mud. Conversations were sparse. Prayers whispered in desperation, memories recounted in murmurs. Thomas sat near a dying fire, sword across his knees, staring at the flames as though they could answer the questions in his mind. Courage had become habitual, a daily act of endurance. Sacrifice was constant, unrecognized, and incomprehensible in its scale. Messages arrived from the north. Enemy forces were regrouping, planning a counterattack to reclaim the town. Commanders moved among the soldiers, plotting maneuvers, calculating risks, issuing orders that would determine the fates of men who had no say in their own survival. England itself seemed to respond to strategy and ambition, indifferent to the suffering it produced. Thomas lay awake through the night, listening to the wind and the distant cries of the wounded. He thought of friends lost, families left behind, fields untended, and a future that might never exist for him. Hope was fragile, fleeting, and dangerous. Each battle, each march, each day was a test of endurance. Survival was temporary. Victory was fragile. The war demanded constant resilience, courage, and the willingness to face horrors that would haunt them forever. As dawn approached again, Thomas rose. His body ached, his mind heavy with the memories of another day of slaughter, yet he had no choice but to march forward. The war pressed relentlessly, demanding another battle, another test of courage and endurance. The roses had been soaked in blood, and England itself was changing. The men who fought, bled, and survived would carry the memory in every scar, every wound, and every shadow of fear that followed them long after the blood-stained soil had hardened. The Wars of the Roses had become a storm from which there was no refuge. Every swing of a sword, every life lost, every village destroyed was part of a chain that bound the fate of England and its people. Thomas tightened his cloak against the cold, grasped his sword, and stepped into gray morning light, knowing that the next battle awaited, as merciless and inevitable as the last. The land itself seemed to whisper more blood to come, of struggles yet unseen, and of a kingdom caught in the unyielding grip of ambition and war. Survival was not guaranteed. Victory was fleeting, and every man, woman, and child in England would feel the cost of a conflict that showed no mercy. The roses had bloomed in blood, and there was no turning back. The cold had settled into every joint and muscle, seeping through armor and cloaks, making each step a laborious task. Thomas Gray's boots were cracked and soaked, his hands stiff from holding a sword for days without respite. Around him, the men moved like shadows through the foggy landscape, faces pale, eyes haunted. They had long since stopped talking, voices silenced by exhaustion and the memory of too many deaths. War had become a relentless teacher, and its lessons were unforgiving. The next strategic point was a river crossing, vital for controlling supply lines and troop movements. Scouts had reported enemy fortifications along the banks, stakes driven into the mud, archers hidden behind palisades, and infantry ready to repel any advance. Commanders gathered, maps spread before them, plotting maneuvers with cold calculation. For them, the lives of hundreds were numbers on a page, moved and sacrificed according to strategy. For the men who would fight, it meant stepping into certain danger without question. The approach to the crossing was tense. Every rustle of leaves, every shift of shadow made men tense. The wind carried the distant clang of metal and the occasional scream from reconnaissance patrols. Thomas kept his head low, eyes scanning, muscles coiled for action. The memory of previous battles weighed heavily. Each step forward was a negotiation with fear, each breath a reminder of mortality. As they neared the river, the enemy revealed itself. Arrows fell like a dark rain, striking men and horses indiscriminately. Shields splintered. Screams rose above the wind and rushing water. The clash of steel rang through the valley, sharp and merciless. Thomas moved instinctively, parrying and striking, pressing forward even as the bodies of comrades and enemies alike fell around him. The crossing itself became a deadly bottleneck. The river, swollen with recent rains, added to the chaos. Horses struggled through the icy water. Men slipped on slick stones, arrows striking from both banks. Thomas helped a wounded comrade across, feeling the weight of him like a stone dragging at his own limbs. Survival depended on constant movement, on relentless focus, and on a willingness to face the fear that never left the soldiers' hearts. The battle escalated as both sides poured forces into the valley. Cavalry charged along narrow approaches, spears bristling, shields raised. Thomas was thrown sideways by the momentum, rolling into mud and barely catching his sword as a horse passed too close. Around him, men fought in tangled clusters, steel clanging against steel, cries of pain and rage mingling with the roar of the river. The turning point came when a hidden contingent of their own forces struck the enemy flank. Soldiers emerged from the trees, blades flashing, forcing the defenders to split their attention. The chaos favored neither side, but allowed Thomas and the men around him to push forward, gaining critical ground inch by inch. Every strike, every shove, every swing of the sword was a small triumph against the overwhelming tide of death surrounding them. Hours passed like days. The riverbank became littered with bodies, horses, and shattered equipment. The air was thick with smoke from fires set to flush out defenders, with the acrid smell of blood and mud mixing into a stench that clung to skin and hair. Thomas felt the weight of exhaustion pressing into him, but retreat was impossible. Survival demanded continued action. Every second attested endurance and nerve. By late afternoon, the battle tilted in their favor. The enemy, depleted and disoriented, began to retreat across the remaining river crossings, leaving behind wounded and dead. The survivors pressed forward, cutting off stragglers, securing the position. Yet even as victory was claimed, Thomas could not ignore the cost. Hundreds lay dead, friends and foes indistinguishable in their final moments. The river itself seemed to mourn, carrying the dead and staining the waters dark with iron. As night fell, the soldiers gathered in small clusters, tending to the wounded and counting losses. Fires burned low, offering little warmth against the chill. Conversation was scarce. Most men stared into flames of the darkness beyond, lost in memories of fallen comrades and destroyed villages. Thomas cleaned his blade, staring at the reflection of firelight on steel, thinking of the friends he had lost and the battles still to come. Messages arrived from commanders, warning of enemy forces regrouping downstream, preparing for a counterattack. The town they had secured now needed to be defended, its position critical but vulnerable. Commanders moved among the men, issuing orders, planning maneuvers, calculating risks. The land itself seemed to respond only to strategy, ambition, and violence, indifferent to the suffering inflicted upon it. Thomas lay awake through the night, listening to the wind, the distant groans of the wounded, and the soft rustle of frost-covered leaves. He thought of home, of fields untended, of families torn apart, and of a future that might never be his. Hope felt fragile, a fleeting illusion. Each day, each battle, each step forward demanded endurance and courage beyond what he had imagined possible. As dawn approached, he rose again, muscles stiff, body battered, yet determined. The war pressed forward, relentless, demanding another march, another confrontation, another test of will. Survival was never guaranteed. Victory was temporary. The roses had been soaked in blood. England itself was changing, reshaping itself with every clash of steel, every life lost, and every village burned. Thomas tightened his cloak against the cold, gripped his sword, and stepped into gray morning light. The next battle awaited, as inevitable and merciless as the last. The Wars of the Roses had become a storm with no refuge. Every swing of the sword and every life lost a link in the chain shaping the fate of a kingdom. Men like Thomas Gray, witnesses to horror and endurance, would carry these memories forever, the cost of war etched into flesh, mind, and soul. The land whispered of more blood to come, of struggles yet unseen, and of a kingdom caught in the unyielding grip of ambition and war. Survival was temporary, victory fragile, and every man, woman, and child in England would feel the weight of a conflict that spared no one. The roses had bloomed in blood, and the storm of war showed no mercy. Winter tightened its grip on the countryside, covering the roads with frost and the fields with a thin, unyielding layer of ice. Thomas Gray marched alongside his men, boots heavy with mud and snow, shoulders aching under the weight of armor and weapons. Every breath formed a sharp, white cloud in the frigid air, reminding them that the cold could kill as easily as any sword. The war had become a relentless rhythm. March, fight, survive, repeat. There was no end, only the next battle, the next river to cross, the next village to seize. Intelligence had arrived. A new Lancastrian force, larger than any they had faced in weeks, was gathering in the north, ready to intercept the army before it could secure supply lines. The commander spoke in hushed tones, spreading maps across the frozen ground and tracing lines with fingers stiff from cold. Each decision was a gamble with countless lives at stake. Thomas listened, knowing that the plans of men far from the battlefield often ignored the horrors that awaited those who carried out the orders. The march toward the enemy was grueling. Frost crunched underfoot, and the river crossings were treacherous, swollen with melted snow. Horses slipped and fell, men struggled to the muck, and every step carried the risk of injury or death. The wind bit through layers of clothing, chilling soldiers to bone, and morale wavered under the combined weight of fatigue and fear. Thomas kept his pace steady, encouraging a young soldier beside him who had been struggling to keep up. "Don't fall behind," he said quietly. "We survived together." They arrived at a narrow valley in the late afternoon, the enemy already in position along the ridges above. Archers crouched behind rocks and fallen trees, ready to rain arrows down on any advance. Infantry lined the slopes, pikes bristling like a forest of metal. The commander surveyed the battlefield, then issued their orders. A feigned retreat would draw the enemy from the high ground, creating an opening for a cavalry strike and infantry charge. The plan was precise, ruthless, and depended on timing that could easily fail. As the soldiers advanced, arrows began to fly, whistling through the air, striking horses and men alike. Shouts and screams mixed with the sound of steel against steel as the first clash erupted along the valley floor. Thomas pressed forward, parrying and striking instinctively, his body moving despite exhaustion. Around him, men fell, Some screaming, others silent, already beyond saving. Mud and blood mixed beneath their feet, making every step treacherous. The enemy reacted as expected, surging down from the ridges to pursue what they believed was a retreating force. That was when the trap was sprung. Hidden units flanked the advancing soldiers, striking from both sides. Horses charged from behind, pikes stabbed upward, and arrows rained down from above. Chaos enveloped the valley. Thomas ducked under a swinging blade, rolling in the mud to avoid a spear, and pushed forward, dragging a wounded comrade out of the immediate line of fire. Survival demanded relentless movement and unflinching focus. Hours passed in a blur of violence. The valley became a slaughterhouse. Bodies littered the frozen ground. Horses fell, screaming, over debris and corpses. The air was thick with smoke from fire set to flush out enemy positions, mingling with the metallic stench of blood. Every swing of a sword, every stab of a pike, every arrow loose was a decision between life and death. Thomas fought on, muscles screaming, lungs burning, yet he could not stop. There was no option to rest or retreat. By late afternoon, the enemy began to falter. Exhaustion, confusion, and the relentless pressure-coordinated attacks forced them to retreat toward the far end of the valley. Soldiers pursued, cutting off stragglers, securing critical positions. The battle, though technically a victory, left hundreds dead and many more wounded. Thomas moved among the survivors, helping the injured, checking on comrades, and silently counting the cost of another day of slaughter. As night fell, fires burned low in the valley, offering scant warmth against the cold. Conversations were few, mostly whispers of prayers, memories, and fears. Thomas sat near a fire, cleaning his sword, staring at the flames as if they could answer questions he dared not voice. Courage had become endurance. Sacrifice was constant, unrecognized, and written into the mud, blood, and sorrow of the battlefield. Orders arrived during the night. Enemy forces were regrouping downstream, preparing for a counterattack. The commanders moved swiftly, issuing directives, repositioning troops, and calculating risks. The soldiers, weary and battered, prepared once again to meet the enemy, knowing that survival required unyielding vigilance. England itself seemed indifferent to their struggle, shaped instead by strategy, ambition, and the relentless tide of war. Thomas lay awake through the long night, listening to the wind, the distant cries of the wounded, and the soft rustle of frost-covered leaves. He thought of friends lost, families left behind, villages burned, and futures that might never come to pass. Hope was fragile and fleeting. Each day demanded courage and endurance beyond what he had imagined possible. Survival was temporary. Victory was fragile. The war had no mercy for weakness or hesitation. As dawn approached again, Thomas rose. His body ached, his mind heavy with memories of another day of slaughter. Yet there was no choice. The war pressed forward, relentless, demanding another march, another battle, another test of courage and resilience. The roses had been soaked in blood. England itself was changing, reshaping itself with every clash of steel, every life lost, and every village destroyed. He tightened his cloak against the cold, gripped his sword, and stepped into the gray morning light. The next battle awaited, as inevitable and merciless as the last. The Wars of the Roses had become a storm from which there was no refuge. Every swing of the sword, every life lost, every village destroyed was a link in the chain shaping the fate of a kingdom. Men like Thomas Gray, witnesses to horror and endurance, would carry these memories forever, the cost of war etched into flesh, mind, and soul. The land whispered of more blood to come, of struggles yet unseen, and of a kingdom caught in the unyielding grip of ambition and war. Survival was temporary. Victory was fleeting. And every man, woman, and child in England would feel the weight of a conflict that spared no one. The roses had bloomed in blood, and the storm showed no mercy. The morning was gray and bitter, the wind cutting through cloaks and armor like a blade. Frost lay thick over the fields, crunching under every step, turning mud into a slick trap for both horse and man. Thomas Gray moved steadily, though every joint and muscle protested, boots caked with mud and frozen earth. Around him, men trod silently, eyes hollow, faces pale, haunted by battles past and the knowledge of those yet to come. The war had transformed them all, teaching that survival was not about bravery but endurance, and courage was measured in hours rather than heroic moments. The army's objective was a fortified bridge spanning a swollen river, vital for controlling northern supply lines. Scouts returned with reports. Enemy archers hidden along the banks, stakes planted in shallow water, and infantry ready to repel any crossing. The commanders gathered in a cold, wind-swept clearing, maps spread on the frozen ground. Fingers traced routes. Plans were whispered in low tones. Lives were weighed against strategy, and every choice could mean survival or death. As they approached, arrows fell in deadly arcs, whistling through the gray morning. Men cried out as shafts struck. Horses reared and panicked, and the clash of steel rang sharp across the ice-coated terrain. Thomas moved instinctively, parrying and striking, pressing forward despite exhaustion, ignoring the thrum of pain in his limbs. Around him, men fell, some screaming, some silent, already beyond saving. Blood and mud mixed underfoot. Each step treacherous, each breath a struggle. The crossing became a crucible. The river, swollen by melting snow, surged violently, carrying debris and threatening to sweep men and horses away. Thomas helped a comrade whose horse had slipped, pulling him from the icy water. Survival demanded constant movement, split-second decisions, and unflinching courage. Panic was a luxury they could not afford. The enemy intensified their assault. Archers fired from concealed positions. Infantry blocked approaches with pikes and shields. Every advance was met with resistance. Every step forward earned in blood. Thomas climbed onto a narrow embankment, sword raised, cutting down anyone who threatened the crossing. Arrows grazed him, stinging, but he ignored the pain, focused entirely on survival and the momentum of the army. Hours passed in a relentless blur. The riverbank was strewn with bodies, horses, and broken weapons. Smoke rose from small fires set to drive out defenders, the air thick with the metallic tang of blood. Thomas pressed forward, dragging the wounded where he could, fighting through fatigue and fear. The soldiers moved as one, disciplined despite exhaustion, driven by necessity rather than hope. By midday, the tide turned. Coordinated attacks from flanking units broke the enemy lines. Cavalry charged from hidden paths. Infantry pressed forward, and the defenders began to crumble under the relentless pressure. The crossing, once a deadly bottleneck, became a gateway to victory. Yet even as the enemy fled, the cost was evident. Hundreds lay dead, more were wounded, and the river itself ran dark with iron from blood-soaked soil. Night fell, and the soldiers gathered near fires that burned low, smoke mingling with the frigid air. Conversations were muted, whispers of prayers, memories, and fears. Thomas sat near a dying fire, sword across his knees, staring at flames that offered little warmth. Courage had become endurance. Sacrifice was constant, unheralded, written into the mud and blood of every battlefield. Orders arrived by rider. Enemy forces were regrouping downstream, preparing for a counterattack to reclaim the bridge. Commanders moved among the troops, issuing directives, repositioning units, and planning for the inevitable. England itself seemed indifferent to the suffering, shaped only by strategy, ambition, and the relentless tide of war. Thomas lay awake through the long night, listening to the wind, the distant cries of the wounded, and the soft rustle of frost-covered leaves. He thought of friends lost, families torn apart, and futures that might never exist. Hope was fragile, fleeting. Each day demanded courage and endurance beyond imagination. Survival was temporary. Victory was uncertain. The war spared no one. As dawn approached, Thomas rose, body battered, mind heavy with memories of slaughter and survival. The war pressed forward, relentless, demanding another march, another battle, another test of endurance. The roses had been soaked in blood, and England itself was changing. Every clash of steel, every life lost, every village burned reshaped the land and its people. He tightened his cloak, gripped his sword, and stepped into the pale morning light. The next battle awaited, merciless and inevitable. The Wars of the Roses had become a storm with no shelter. Every swing of the sword, every life lost, every village destroyed was a link in the chain shaping the fate of England. Men like Thomas Gray, witnesses to horror and survival, would carry these memories forever, the cost etched into flesh, mind, and soul. The land whispered of more blood to come, struggles yet unseen, and a kingdom caught in the grip of ambition and war. Survival was temporary, victory fragile, and every man, woman, and child in England would feel the weight of a conflict that spared no one. The roses had bloomed in blood, and the storm offered no mercy. The dawn was pale, a faint gray over the frost-hardened fields, the cold biting through cloaks and armor with relentless insistence. Thomas Gray moved among the ranks, each step a reminder of the long marches, the battles fought and the friends lost. The men around him were ghosts of themselves, faces drawn and hollow, eyes haunted by sights too terrible to forget. War had stripped them of illusion, leaving endurance, discipline, and raw survival as their only tools. Intelligence reports had arrived the previous night. A Lancastrian force, larger and better supplied than anticipated, was preparing to ambush them at a crossroads on the northern road. The commander studied maps, whispered strategies, and issued orders with meticulous precision. Every decision held the weight of life and death, and every soldier on the ground understood that they were expendable pieces in a larger game. Thomas adjusted his sword, checking the blade, and prepared to follow orders that might demand everything from him and his men. The march to the crossroads was grueling. Mud and ice slowed movement. Frost clung to every surface, and the wind cut deep through clothing and armor. Horses stumbled, men slipped, and the terrain itself seemed determined to punish them. Even the birds and wildlife had disappeared, leaving the valley silent except for the crunch of boots and the distant clatter of reconnaissance patrols. Every step demanded focus. Every breath carried the weight of fear and anticipation. As they approached the crossroads, the enemy revealed itself. Archers positioned on the hillsides opened fire, a deadly rain of arrows hissing through the frigid air. Shields splintered, horses screamed, and men fell, their cries swallowed by the chaos. Thomas moved instinctively, parrying strikes, thrusting his sword, and pressing forward despite exhaustion. Around him, the clash of steel and screams of the dying filled the air, every second a test of endurance and will. The battle quickly became a fight for every foot of ground. Cavalry surged along the narrow paths, spears bristling, swords flashing. Infantry fought in tangled clusters, the mud beneath their feet slick with blood and ice. Thomas fought without thought, each motion instinctive, driven by survival and the relentless need to push forward. Men fell beside him, friends, strangers, enemies indistinguishable in the heat of combat. Blood and mud merged underfoot, every step in negotiation with the inevitability of death. A turning point came when the commanders executed a coordinated flanking maneuver. Hidden units emerged from the trees, striking the enemy from the sides, while cavalry charged the rear. Confusion rippled through the Lancastrian ranks. Thomas pressed the advantage, cutting down any who blocked the path, dragging wounded men to relative safety when possible. Victory was within reach, yet the cost was visible in every fallen comrade, every destroyed horse, every building scorched or broken. By late afternoon, the enemy began to falter. Exhausted and disorganized, they retreated toward the distant hills, leaving behind the dead and wounded. The soldiers pressed on, securing the crossroads, though every advance was a reminder of the brutality they had endured. Thomas walked among survivors, tending to the injured, checking on friends, and counting silently the lives lost in yet another battle. Victory had been claimed, but at a staggering cost. Night fell over the valley, fires burning low against the frost, smoke curling into the icy air. Conversation was sparse, mostly whispers of prayers and memories. Thomas sat beside one such fire, sword across his knees, staring into the flames. Courage had become endurance, a constant act of survival rather than heroism. Sacrifice was unending, recognized only in the memories carried by those who survived. Riders arrived under cover of night with messages. Enemy forces were regrouping farther north, planning a counterattack that could undo the day's hard-won gains. Commanders moved swiftly, issuing new orders, repositioning troops, and calculating risks with cold precision. England itself seemed indifferent to the human suffering, shaped instead by strategy, ambition, and relentless violence. Thomas lay awake, listening to the wind and the distant cries of the wounded. He thought of families left behind, fields untended, and futures that might never exist. Hope was fragile and fleeting. Each day demanded courage and endurance beyond imagination. Survival was temporary, victory uncertain. The war had no mercy for weakness or hesitation. As dawn approached again, Thomas rose, body aching, mind heavy with the memories of slaughter and survival. The war pressed forward, relentless, demanding another march, another confrontation, another test of endurance. The roses had been soaked in blood, and England itself was changing. Every clash of steel, every life lost, every village destroyed reshaped the land and its people. He tightened his cloak against the cold, gripped his sword, and stepped into gray morning light. The next battle awaited, merciless and inevitable. The Wars of the Roses had become a storm with no refuge. Every swing of the sword, every life lost, every village destroyed was a link in the chain shaping the fate of England. Men like Thomas Grey, witnesses to horror and endurance, would carry these memories forever, the cost etched into flesh, mind, and soul. The land whispered of more blood to come, struggles yet unseen, and a kingdom caught in the unyielding grip of ambition and war. Survival was temporary, victory fragile, and every man, woman, and child in England would feel the weight of a conflict that spared no one. The roses had bloomed in blood, and the storm of war offered no mercy. The morning air was sharp and merciless, cutting through layers of clothing and armor, making every breath a labor. Frost glazed the fields, and the mud beneath the soldiers' boots froze into treacherous slabs. Thomas Grey moved steadily among his men, muscles stiff, back aching, eyes scanning constantly for threats. Around him, the army moved in grim silence, the weight of countless battles pressing down upon them. They had long since learned that survival was a matter of endurance, not valor, and courage was measured in hours rather than heroic moments. The next objective was a small fortified village perched atop a hill, its position controlling the road to the north. Scouts reported trenches dug around the perimeter, archers concealed in the roofs and windows, and infantry ready to repel any attack. The commanders huddled over maps, whispering strategies, weighing risks, and calculating the costs and lives. Every decision meant blood. Every maneuver demanded sacrifice. Thomas adjusted his sword and shield, preparing to follow orders that could demand everything from him and his men. The march toward the village was grueling. The frost-laden ground slowed their progress, and the icy wind bit through layers of clothing. Horses stumbled, men slipped, and the cold sapped strength from every limb. Even the natural sounds of the countryside were muted, leaving only the crunch of boots, the distant clatter of reconnaissance patrols, and the occasional cry of a bird. Every step demanded focus. Every movement carried the weight of imminent danger. As they approached the village, the enemy revealed itself. Archers positioned along the walls unleashed a deadly hail of arrows. Men fell instantly. Horses reared, and the clash of steel rang through the cold morning air. Thomas moved instinctively, parrying and striking, pressing forward despite exhaustion. Around him, chaos reigned. Friends fell, enemies pressed, and the mud underfoot became slick with blood and ice. Every second was a battle against death itself. The assault quickly became a brutal fight for every inch of ground. Narrow paths funneled men into deadly choke points. Cavalry surged where they could, pikes bristled, and infantry pressed against the walls with relentless determination. Thomas fought without thought, every motion instinctive, driven by survival and the need to push forward. Men fell beside him, friends, strangers, enemies indistinguishable in the heat of combat. Blood and mud mixed beneath their feet, and every swing of the sword could be the difference between life and death. Hours passed in a blur of violence. The village streets became a slaughterhouse. Fires burned to flush out defenders, the air thick with smoke and the metallic scent of blood. Thomas pressed forward, dragging wounded comrades where possible, fighting through fatigue, fear, and despair. The soldiers moved with grim coordination, disciplined despite exhaustion, driven by necessity rather than hope. By late afternoon, the tide of battle turned. A flanking unit emerged from the trees surrounding the village, striking the enemy from the sides while cavalry charged the rear. Confusion rippled through the defenders' ranks, and Thomas pressed the advantage, cutting down those who blocked the path, helping the injured where he could. Victory was within reach, Yet the cost was written plainly in every fallen comrade, every shattered horse, every ruined building. As evening fell, the soldiers gathered to tend the wounded, assess losses, and secure the village. Fires burned low, the smoke curling into the chill air. Conversations were few, whispers of prayers, memories, and fears. Thomas sat near a fire, cleaning his sword, staring into the flames. Courage had become endurance. Sacrifice was constant, unrecognized, and etched into every scar, every wound, every trembling hand. Messages arrived that night. Enemy forces were regrouping, planning a counterattack at first light. Commanders moved among the soldiers, issuing new orders, repositioning troops, calculating risks. The soldiers, weary and battered, prepared once again to face the enemy, knowing that survival depended on relentless vigilance. England itself seemed indifferent to their suffering, shaped only by strategy, ambition, and the relentless tide of war. Thomas lay awake, listening to the wind and the distant cries of the wounded. He thought of villages burned, families torn apart, fields left untended, and futures that might never be realized. Hope was fragile, fleeting. Each day demanded courage and endurance beyond imagination. Survival was temporary. Victory was uncertain. The war spared no one. As dawn approached, Thomas rose. His body ached. His mind weighed down by memories of the slaughter and survival. The war pressed forward, relentless, demanding another march, another confrontation, another test of resilience. The roses had been soaked in blood, and England itself was changing. Every clash of steel, every life lost, every village destroyed reshaped the land and its people. He tightened his cloak against the cold, gripped his sword, and stepped into the gray morning light. The next battle awaited, as inevitable and merciless as the last. The Wars of the Roses had become a storm with no shelter. Every swing of the sword, every life lost, every village destroyed was a link in the chain shaping the fate of England. Men like Thomas Grey, witnesses to horror and endurance, would carry these memories forever, the cost etched into flesh, mind, and soul. The land whispered of more blood to come, struggles yet unseen, and a kingdom caught in the unyielding grip of ambition and war. Survival was temporary, victory fragile, and every man, woman, and child in England it would feel the weight of a conflict that spared no one. The roses had bloomed in blood, and the storm offered no mercy. The cold had become a constant companion, creeping into bones and joints, making every step and every movement a battle against fatigue. Thomas Grey moved among the soldiers, armor weighed heavy on his shoulders, boots frozen and stiff from days of marching. Around him, the men shuffled silently, faces pale, eyes hollow from witnessing too many horrors. They had long since learned that endurance was more crucial than bravery, and that survival required a continuous act of focus, discipline, and stubborn will. The next objective was a key fortress perched on a rocky outcrop, overlooking the valley and controlling the main route to the southern plains. Scouts had reported the enemy's fortifications. High walls reinforced with timber and stone, archers positioned on every parapet, and infantry ready to repel any attack. Commanders studied maps in the early morning cold, their fingers tracing possible approaches, weighing risks, calculating costs and human lives. For them, the strategy mattered above all else. For Thomas and the men on the ground, it meant stepping into a furnace of steel and blood with little hope of reprieve. The march to the fortress was exhausting. Frost-coated fields slowed their advance, and narrow mountain paths were treacherous, horses stumbling on slick rocks, men slipping in mud and ice. The wind cut sharply, chilling the soldiers to the bone. Even the natural sounds of the countryside were muted, leaving only the crunch of boots, the distant clatter of reconnaissance patrols, and the occasional cry of a raven. Every step demanded attention. Every movement carried the weight of imminent danger. As they neared the fortress, the enemy opened fire. Arrows rained down from the battlements, whistling through the air, striking men and horses indiscriminately. Shields splintered, screams pierced the wind, and the clash of steel rang sharp through the valley. Thomas moved instinctively, parrying strikes and striking back, pressing forward despite exhaustion. Around him, chaos reigned. Comrades fell, enemies pressed, and the frozen ground became slick with mud, blood, and ice. Every second was a test of endurance, every swing of a sword a negotiation with death. The assault soon became a struggle for every inch of ground. Narrow approaches funneled men into deadly choke points. Cavalry surged where possible, pikes bristled, and infantry pressed forward with unyielding determination. Thomas fought without hesitation, every motion instinctive, driven by the urgent need to survive and a push forward. Men fell beside him, friends, strangers, enemies indistinguishable in the heat of combat. Blood and mud merged beneath their feet, and every decision, every strike, could mean life or death. Hours passed in a blur of violence. The fortress grounds became a theater of slaughter. Fires were lit to flush out defenders, the air thick with smoke and a metallic stench of blood. Thomas pressed forward relentlessly, dragging wounded comrades when he could, moving through fatigue, fear, and despair. Soldiers maintained grim coordination, disciplined despite exhaustion, driven by necessity rather than hope. By late afternoon, the tide shifted in favor of Thomas's army. A flanking unit emerged from hidden paths, striking the defenders from the sides, while cavalry charged the rear. Confusion spread among the enemy, giving Thomas a chance to press his advantage, cutting down those who blocked the way, aiding the injured when possible. Victory seemed within reach, yet the cause was unmistakable. Fallen comrades, broken horses, and burned structures littered the ground. As evening descended, the soldiers tended to the wounded and counted the dead, securing their new position within the fortress. Fires burned low, smoke rising into the frosty night sky. Conversations were sparse, whispers of prayers, memories, and fears dominating. Thomas sat near a fire, cleaning his sword, staring into flames as though they could provide answers. Courage had become endurance. Sacrifice was constant, unrecognized, and recorded only in the scars, the wounds, and the exhaustion etched into every survivor. Riders arrived under the cover of darkness with urgent messages. Enemy forces were regrouping further north, preparing a counterattack. Commanders moved swiftly, issuing new orders, repositioning troops, and calculating risks with precision. The soldiers, battered and weary, prepared once again to face the enemy, knowing survival depended on unbroken vigilance. England itself seemed indifferent to their suffering, shaped only by strategy, ambition, and the relentless tide of war. Thomas lay awake through the night, listening to the wind and distant cries of the wounded. He thought of villages burned, families torn apart, fields left untended, and futures that might never be realized. Hope was fragile, fleeting. Each day demanded courage and endurance beyond what he had ever imagined. Survival was temporary, victory uncertain. The war spared no one. As dawn approached, Thomas rose, body battered, mind weighed down with memories of slaughter and survival. The war pressed forward, relentless, demanding another march, another confrontation, another test of resilience. The roses had been soaked in blood, and England itself was changing. Every clash of steel, every life lost, every village destroyed reshaped the land and its people. He tightened his cloak, gripped his sword, and stepped into gray morning light. The next battle awaited, merciless and inevitable. The Wars of the Roses had become a storm with no shelter. Every swing of the sword, every life lost, every village destroyed was a link in the chain shaping the fate of England. Men like Thomas Grey, witnesses of horror and endurance, would carry these memories forever, the cost etched into flesh, mind, and soul. The land whispered of more blood to come, struggles yet unseen, and a kingdom caught in the unyielding grip of ambition and war. Survival was temporary, victory fragile, and every man, woman, and child in England would feel the weight of a conflict that spared no one. The roses had bloomed in blood, and the storm of war showed no mercy. The frost lingered even as the sun began its slow climb over the northern hills, casting long, pale shadows across a battlefield that looked more like a graveyard than a place of war. Thomas Grey moved among the survivors, shoulders aching under the weight of armor and the memories of countless battles. Around him, men shuffled silently, faces drawn and hollow, eyes haunted by horrors that refused to leave them. The war had taken everything from them: the innocence of youth, the illusions of honor, the certainty of survival. Only endurance remained, and even that was fragile. The army's next objective was the final strategic town along the southern route, a fortress town whose capture would secure supply lines and cripple the enemy's ability to coordinate future attacks. Scouts returned with reports of trenches, archers, and infantry ready to defend every wall and gate. Commanders gathered, maps spread across frozen ground, whispering strategies, calculating risks, and weighing the costs in human lives. For them, lives were numbers. For the men who would execute the orders, it meant marching once more into the maw of death. Thomas adjusted his sword, steeling himself for the inevitable confrontation. The march to the fortress was arduous. Frost-covered fields slowed their advance. Icy wind cut through clothing and armor, and the narrow roads were treacherous. Horses stumbled, men fell, and the cold seemed determined to sap their strength before the enemy even appeared. The natural sounds of the countryside were gone, replaced by the crunch of boots on ice, the occasional bark of a dog, and the distant calls of scouts. Every step was a test of endurance. Every breath carried the weight of fear and anticipation. As they approached the fortress, the enemy revealed itself. Arrows fell in deadly arcs, whistling to the freezing air, striking men and horses alike. Shields splintered. Screams echoed across the fields, and the clash of steel rang sharp and unforgiving. Thomas moved instinctively, parrying and striking, pressing forward despite fatigue. Around him, chaos reigned. Men fell beside him. Friends, strangers, enemies indistinguishable in the fog of battle. Blood and mud mixed beneath their feet, and every moment demanded vigilance and courage. The assault soon became a battle for every inch of the fortress. Narrow approaches funneled soldiers into deadly choke points. Cavalry surged where the rain allowed, and infantry pressed against walls with relentless determination. Thomas fought instinctively, every motion driven by survival, every strike a negotiation with the ever-present shadow of death. Around him, the clash of metal, the screams of the wounded, and the roar of commanders issuing orders created cacophony that would haunt him forever. Hours passed in the blur of violence. Fires were lit to flush defenders from barricades, smoke thickening the air, mingling with the metallic scent of blood and burning wood. Thomas moved tirelessly, dragging wounded comrades, striking down any who blocked the way, ignoring exhaustion and fear. Soldiers maintained grim coordination, disciplined despite fatigue, driven by necessity rather than hope. By late afternoon, the fortress defenses began to crumble. Hidden flanking units struck from the surrounding hills, while cavalry charged the rear. Confusion spread among the defenders, giving Thomas the opportunity to press forward. Bodies littered the ground, horses fell screaming, and every victory was measured in sacrifice. The town was theirs, yet the triumph was hollow. Hundreds of soldiers lay dead, many more wounded, and the landscape itself bore the scars of relentless violence. As night fell, fires burned low across the captured town, the smoke curling into the bitterly cold air. Soldiers tended the wounded, assessed losses, and fortified their position. Conversations were sparse, whispers of prayers, memories, and fears dominating the silence. Thomas sat beside a fire, sword across his knees, staring into flames. Courage had become endurance. Sacrifice was constant, unrecognized, and recorded only in the scars, the wounds, and the exhaustion etched into every survivor. Riders arrived during the night with urgent messages. Enemy forces were regrouping even farther north, plotting counterattacks to reclaim lost ground. Commanders moved swiftly, issuing new orders, repositioning troops, and calculating risks. The soldiers, battered and weary, prepared once again to face the enemy, knowing that survival depended on unbroken vigilance. England itself seemed indifferent to their suffering, shaped only by strategy, ambition, and relentless conflict. Thomas lay awake, listening to the wind, the distant groans of the wounded, and the soft rustle of frost-covered leaves. He thought of families lost, villages burned, fields untended, and futures that might never be realized. Hope was fragile, fleeting. Each day demanded courage and endurance beyond imagination. Survival was temporary, victory uncertain. The war spared no one. As dawn approached, Thomas rose for what might be the final march. His body ached from countless battles, his mind heavy with the memories of slaughter, survival, and loss. The war pressed forward relentlessly, demanding yet another confrontation. The roses had been soaked in blood, and England itself was changing. Every clash of steel, every life lost, every village destroyed reshaped the land and its people. He tightened his cloak against the cold, gripped his sword, and stepped into the gray morning light. The final battle awaited, merciless and inevitable. The Wars of the Roses had become a storm with no shelter. Every swing of the sword, every life lost, every village destroyed was a link in the chain shaping the fate of England. Men like Thomas Grey, witnesses to horror and endurance, would carry these memories forever, the cost etched into flesh, mind, and soul. The land whispered of more blood to come, struggles yet unseen, and a kingdom caught in the unyielding grip of ambition and war. Survival was temporary, victory fragile, and every man, woman, and child in England would feel the weight of a conflict that spared no one. The roses had bloomed in blood, and the storm of war had left a legacy that would haunt generations. In that still, bitter dawn, Thomas understood the full measure of what they had endured. Courage was not the absence of fear. It was pressing forward despite it. Sacrifice was not honored with glory. It was etched silently into the soil, carried in memory, and paid in blood. And the cost of war? It was a toll exacted on every living soul, on every village, on every heart brave enough to survive. England had been transformed forever, and those who bore witness would never forget. The roses had bloomed, crimson and unyielding, and the storm had passed, leaving a land forever marked by the courage, the sacrifice, and the price of war.